It has begun.
I'm not working. Sorry. I got too much on my mind here.
Ready to go.
Ready to go?
Yep.
Can everybody hear me? Oh, Bobber! All right.
Setting my timer.
Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. Thank you for coming. I'd like to thank Sheila and Darby and Ginger of the Nanaimo North Library for 7/8 of their audiovisual capability tonight. Big shout out to Professor Murray Welty, my audiovisual guru, who will record every awkward moment of this seance for posterity. The thing you first heard was called the Dawn Chorus. And that's what the birds do in New Zealand, because there were once upon a time only birds. And when Captain James Cook came into Poverty Bay in 1769, his sailors had to use the batting from their muskets to put in their ears because, as Joseph Banks described it, the pain was excruciating. Okay, never heard it, right? So the Dawn Chorus is less than it was, and it was less than it was originally before the Maoris arrived and knocked off 40% of the bird population. And now it's just basically a shell of what it used to be. And instead, in the middle of a hot summer day, we have the cicada chorus. Which is where this legend begins. So if you haven't already, hi Don, asked the right questions, you may ask yourself the right questions. There are 3 questions you need to ask about this book. The first is, why does a narrative nonfiction guy like me decide to write a historical novel? Good question. Why is it set in New Zealand of all places? And what uniquely qualifies this guy to write this book? So, in my inimitable style, I will start with the second question. Why is it set in New Zealand? Why, in fact, is it set in the North Island? And why, in fact, is it set on a Coromandel Peninsula in the North Island? Why, in fact, is it situated on the Kuatunu Peninsula between Kuatunu Bay and Opito Bay on the Coromandel Peninsula on the North Island in New Zealand? Well, to answer that question, I have to tell you a little story. Once upon a time, there was a handsome young Canadian doctor. Once upon a time, who, before he set off on his 5-year trip around the world, had his brother come to him and tell him that under no circumstances whatever should he ever find and bring home a girl from New Zealand. And I asked him why, and he said, well, I can't afford the postage and I sure can't afford the airfare. So 3 years later, when I met her in the Cairo airport at 3 o'clock in the morning, I forgot all about the postage. And didn't my little maple syrup world turn into pavlova and pineapple lumps and hokey pokey ice cream in a big hurry? So when I got to New Zealand, my beautiful wife-to-be and I decided I needed some work, so I got a locum, physician locum in Rotorua. And I was still hitchhiking, and she came along, but she didn't quite have the knack for it because she started throwing rocks at the cars And we arrived late for the East Indian doctor that was waiting for me to take over his practice, and he was none too impressed when he found out how we got there. Anyway, on the way, when she finally stopped throwing rocks, there was a van load of Maori boys that picked us up. And she got in the back with some Maori boys, and I got in the passenger seat. And I looked over at the driver, and here's this big Maori bloke, and he had a massive black curly hair, and he had an earring, and he was tanned, and he had attitude. And he looked over, and he saw a guy with a big massive black curly hair and an earring who was tanned with just as much attitude. So we were driving along, and he's looking at me, and he's looking at me, and he's kind of missing the corners every so often. And finally he says, "Hey, bro, which island you from?" And I turned to him and I said, "Vancouver." He said, "Vancouver? I don't know that one." So, this is not answering the question as to why this is set in New Zealand, but 10 years ago, we bought a shotgun shack in between Kuatuna Bay and Opito Bay on the Kuatuna Peninsula, on the Coromandel Peninsula in the North Island of New Zealand. And that shotgun shack overlooks the most beautiful beach in the world. And I can't tell you where it is. And beside the shotgun shack runs a stream, which has been a source of tranquility and peace for me for the last 10 years. And I called it my BOLTHOLE. So why is this book set in New Zealand? Well, here you go.
You may find yourself living in a shotgun shack. You may find yourself in another part of the world. You may find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile. You may find yourself in a beautiful house with a beautiful wife. And you may ask yourself, well, how did I get here?
And so you may ask yourself, why does a narrative nonfiction guy decide to write this historical novel? Well, I'd already begun to write natural history books about other places. I had Westwood Lake Chronicles and 11 other books. And I was burning to write a book about this place, a chronicle of the seasons from the viewpoint of resident plants and animals. And my wife, my beautiful wife, told me I would do no such thing. And I said, well, why not? And she said, because here we have peace and quiet. Here we have seclusion. Here we have privacy. And if you write that son of a bitch, that's all going to disappear. Oops, we just popped an elastic band. And I get that. You know, I understand that if you come into the public eye too often, you're going to get friends, right? So I asked her, I said, well, what can I write? And she said, you can write fiction. And I said, well, I can't write fiction. She said, well, you can now. So she gave me permission, and she said, so that no one would ever know. It's not working out too well for her. So there's the third question. What uniquely qualifies this guy to write it? And I have to tell you, I gave this talk, this author reading in New Zealand a couple months ago. And they're a tough crowd, right? For New Zealanders, I had committed the ultimate cultural sin of appropriation and globalization, and they lived in terror of my accent, and they were having none of it because it was all dread and horror for them. So I had to establish some legitimacy. So here's what I did. I said, been around the world, wrote a few books about it. They like that. Kiwi beautiful wife for 30 years. They like that. Kiwi shotgun shack for 10 years. They like that. And then I told them about an existential slap. So, about 4 years ago now almost, I got some bad news. In fact, I got what I thought was very bad news, but as it turns out, the bad news wasn't that bad so far. And so my eyes were suddenly open to everything, and that qualifies me to write about anything. And I started to channel Hemingway a little bit because he's a buddy of mine. He says, but you are more alone because that is how you must work, and the time to work is shorter all the time. And if you waste it, you feel you've committed a sin for which there is no forgiveness. So how did I make the shift? There's a fourth question. How did I make the shift from natural philosophy to epic fiction? Well, I didn't start with a plot because I don't write fiction. I started out the way I always do, in nonfiction, backwards. And I was struggling with two inherent contradictions. I had this damn existential slap that provided the inspiration. Sorry, I got it. And that caused me to concentrate on random acts of observation, which led me to a process of deliberate inquiry, which generated a catalog of backyard elements, places, people, things, ideas. And I started to wonder what dramatic events had occurred on that beach below the shotgun shack over the brief but turbulent history of this country. And then it became a narrative, a meaning-making time machine of causality and centrality and form and shape and landscape and voice. And finally, I got an anthem. A big brass band of arpeggios, major chord snapshots in time and space, a celebration of three men over as many centuries in New Zealand, a saga of individual Coromandel conflicts between two Maori chiefs, two gold miners, and two recreational property owners whose lives and deaths became interconnected. So I write with the idea that there are three basic truths in writing. Everything has a story. We protect what we love. And this one's not quite right. It should read, we should write what we know, but there's a lot of middle-aged fat white guys writing Harlequin romances, and that's probably just gone out the window. So before I do the reading, I'm just going to go through in the bolt hole what the places, the people, the things, and the ideas are, just briefly, to give you some context here. So the main